So some of us work and some of us are retired and still working at something, and some of us will never retire because we're always working at something. But this fourth commandment is about work and labor, and in a way, it's about the idol of our modern life. It's a God we serve. It's a thing that occupies our mind, that always occupies our mind, whether or not we're working. Last week, we had that little setup where my phone rang, and I pulled it out, and I said, oh gosh, excuse me, I've got to take this right now. How many of you experienced that this week at some point where the phone rang and you were in the middle of doing something and you picked up the phone to do something with it? Let's show of hands. Well, there are a few honest people in the room. Yeah. And we do that a lot for work. I have a son-in-law that's in real estate business. He does remodeling and that kind of thing. And he had to get a new phone. There was something wrong with his phone. And when the person came back out after doing the diagnostics, they said, there's something wrong with this phone. Said you have 8,000 emails on this phone? You have 960 calls in 1 month? He said, yeah. He said, that's my work. He said, that's my lifeline. He said, that's how I get business done. And he said, I have learned that it's more important for me to pick up the phone and call somebody and have a conversation than it is to do texting or email. It's more efficient. Do you realize that? It's more efficient, he said. And besides that, a two-way conversation gets a whole lot more accomplished than that texting back and forth constantly where you're having to figure out what somebody understood. He said, I get to talk to people. He said, the problem with it is I'm talking to them all the time. We have a lot of that in our lives. And Jesus says that Sabbath is important to us for lots of reasons. The commandment says that Sabbath is important to us. Why? What does the commandment say that's the reason for Sabbath? Huh? For rest? To keep it holy? Right? 6 days you'll labor. It's interesting that for us, the focus is so much on rest when the truth is our lives are busy and busy because of our choices. 40 years ago, life was busy because of have-tos. Right? We worked on farms. We worked at things. We did this. We did that. There was a lot of work to always have to be doing. And we got promised a life of leisure. Do you remember that? There would be a time that computers would do all the work and we could play. I'm old enough to remember that fantasy, right? And what has happened? Well, we have a computer in our pocket and we're working all the time. We're constantly working with it. The scripture is not so much about rest, is it? It's that the animals, everybody needs rest, but it tells us that God consecrated the day, that it would be holy. And why is that important? Why is that such an important part of why this commandment was there? I don't ask rhetorical questions, so I'm going to wait you out because I want you to think. Why is the holiness of Sabbath important? Enough to be one of the Big Ten. Time for relationships? Relationships, yeah. To refocus on what, Gail? On spiritual things? On what Jesus wants us to do? It's, it's okay to say the word God in this room, right? I mean, we Presbyterians, I don't know why we have difficulties with that. It's a day we're supposed to focus on God. Keep the Sabbath holy. We're supposed to think about God. We're supposed to think our lives with God. We're supposed to think about our lives in the perspective of what God thinks about us. We're supposed to think about how our lives reflect the values that we're trying to live and how God supports us in our daily lives. We have God on our side, and we can forget that, and life gets hard for us. Does that make sense? There's a reason that we're supposed to stop from our labors. It gives us relief from all of the things that we think are pressing in on us so badly that they wind up dominating our life. And so we distance ourselves from those one day a week, and we are able to think about our lives in deeper ways, in broader ways, in ways of meaning. That Greek word kairos, about the meaning of moments and the meaning of days. And think about how we need to be choosing things that enhance that meaning and purpose, and that there are some things that we're probably doing that aren't really helping that for us or for the world or for the people around us, so that we can sift that in a management of our time in holy ways. Make sense? We use the word stewardship. I know that's a word we really don't want to talk about in church either, but what is stewardship? It's making good use of resources. Yeah. It's management. Taking care of the community. It's taking care of ourselves. It's taking care of the church. It's the way that we manage our time, our resources, our money, our energy, all of those things. And stewardship tells us that we're just managers. And who's the one that we're trying to manage for?
Ourselves.
God. It's just that simple. And we need that reminder, don't we? And you get that reminder here in worship, hopefully, and that kind of thing. I think it's interesting. God worked for 6 days in the first creation story. In the first creation story, right? I mean, we have 2 creation stories. And read Genesis 1 and 2. In one of them, human beings are the climax of creation, late in creation, and in the other, the human being is the first thing. So and both of those came from mythical, other kinds of sources, the Code of Hammurabi and other kind of things. The point of the reason it's in text is not because it explains how the world was made. The point of them putting it in the text was who made the world and who we belong to. And we belong to God. And that's something to celebrate and something to work at and something that gives us a deep sense of the why that's behind our working. We have a bunch of confessions in the Book of Confessions. They are historical documents. They are there for us to read, mark, and inwardly digest. They help us understand Scripture and that kind of thing. And I kind of ignore some of them, I'll be honest with you. But I went back to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And the Westminster Confession of Faith has two teaching documents that are part of it: the larger catechism and the smaller catechism. And guess what gets taught in both of those question and answer teaching tools? Every elder should know this. I mean, haven't you memorized the Westminster Confession of Faith? Yeah, the Ten Commandments. There's an explanation of each of the Ten Commandments. And I thought we should just, this is the shorter catechism. How is the Sabbath to be sanctified, consecrated? The Sabbath is to be sanctified by a holy resting all that day, even from such worldly employments and recreations as are lawful on other days, and spending the whole time in the public and private exercise of God's worship, except so much as in it is taken up in the works of necessity and mercy. It's about the whole day. It's about a sense of attentiveness, a sense of awareness, a thought about God through the day. And I'll confess that especially for me, it's hard for me to focus on God for an hour, much less a day, right? I mean, number one, I found out kind of late in my life I was severely ADD in a different kind of way, and my mind's racing around with 8 or 9 things in it all the time. And so the thought of focusing is really tough, but I can always go back to God, and I wind up doing that. And for some strange reason on Sunday, in spite of the job I've got and the rest of that, Sunday's a day when I'm thinking about God, I'm generally thinking about me and God more than you and God. And I get to take stock. I get to take stock. I'm trying to be mindful of time today. So let's read the gospel lesson. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his followers began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they doing something that's not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was the high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some of it to his companions." Then they said to him, he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So take note that it's not eating that was the work that broke the law, broke Torah law. It was the work they did to eat. It was the plucking of the grain. The Pharisees had turned the 10 Commandments into a long list of do nots on the Sabbath. Any kind of thing that appeared to be work was something you could not do on the Sabbath. You know, my Old Testament professor always said that a person could not look in the mirror on the Sabbath because they might see a gray hair and pluck it out. And that would be work. Now, that is creating a Sabbath that's not made for humankind, but a humankind that has to be so obsessive about not working that the Sabbath becomes the worst work day of the week in their heads. Because they have to be careful about doing all these holy things and not doing anything unholy. And Jesus comes back and says, now wait a minute, just wait a minute. Let's go back to the real reason for Sabbath. It's a commandment because it's good for you. It's not an odious thing. It is good for you. It is something that's here to help you. It is something that puts your life in perspective, that gives you time to actually think. Two things. I walked into my professor's office one day and he was staring at a computer screen. It was an old computer screen. It was 1970 and it was a green screen. Remember those? You know, and that was back in the days of DOS kind of thing, you know. It was something new. He was on a committee at Duke and he was having to do some work. And he was frustrated. And it was not good for Harmon to get frustrated. And he finally said, you know, David, this is a conspiracy. This whole thing is a conspiracy. Sooner or later, they're going to invent something that is going to make us work all the time staring at this screen, and we will not have time to have one single independent creative thought in our whole life. I'm not going to say we're there, but I'm a pastor and I spend an awful lot of time staring at that screen and doing emails and the rest of that. I need a day off from it. I need to turn it all off. And I'm not sure I can do that. I'm not sure I can, because something might come up that would really be important that I would need to take care of as a pastor. I don't know how to do that. I don't know about you, but that's a worry I have. On the second Sunday in November, I'm generally busy somewhere else. It's the opening weekend of deer season, and I have a group of guys from First Presbyterian Church, Austin, and we're on the banks of the Pedernales River for that weekend. The chili that I made for the time, that was a deer I harvested on that weekend. When I was a kid, my dad was a refrigeration repairman. He installed air conditioners in cars in the summer, and in the winter, he had a service contract with a dairy equipment company, and he took care of a lot of dairies down in South Texas because they had these great big huge stainless steel tanks, and the truck came by every 2 days. And when that went down, that was not good. He'd get called in the middle of the night, whatever. He always had a rifle in his car because I wasn't aware of this at all, but meat was really expensive. And we had a chest freezer that he had fixed and put in the house. And so he would go and fix whatever was the problem, and then he'd sit in the truck with his coffee thermos and wait for dawn, and the does would come out of the brush and go to the silage field. And then when they came back out, he would pick the one that was the fattest and the biggest, and he would shoot it, and it became meat in the freezer. People don't believe me, but I grew up on marbled venison. because all they had to do was walk about 50 yards and walk about 50 yards, and that was it, and lay down. And so I grew up on marbled venison, and these guys and I spend this weekend together. I go because of the conversation around the table at night, because they're all elders and Christians and great guys, and we have an absolute rule that we cannot talk about First Presbyterian Church Austin. We can't talk about that. I'm very careful about boundaries, and sooner or later you'll get a letter from me that says in nice words, we can continue to be friends, we can talk about golf, we can talk about kids, my grandkids, whatever. We can talk about church in general, but if you say one thing about University Presbyterian Church to me, we're done forever. So, but we talk about church. One of these guys is in a commercial construction company. He owns this commercial construction company. And he was talking about things, and he had his phone sitting there on the table, and it rang. And he said, you know, I just can't get away from this thing. He said, I can't. He said, I put it on silent in the blind, but I had to answer something. He said, it just drives my life. He said, it's just awful. He said, the truth is, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have Sunday. He said, I don't know what I'd do. He said, even when Corinna and I are away and go on vacation or something, it's hard for me to get through the next week because it gets to me and I wind up serving the phone. I have to have this point in my life every week where my compass gets reset. Sabbath is for the resetting of your compass. Sabbath is for recreating you. Sabbath is not about doing all kinds of fun things and the rest of that. Sabbath is about your chance to get your life in a place that you want it to be. We should all try that. God's recommended that for a long, long time. And so this day, for the rest of the day, when you're tempted to do some work, when you're tempted to get that thing done that you've been wanting to do, when you're tempted to be distracted by something that isn't going to do you any good anyway, or otherwise, stop and say, it's Sabbath, and this is a sacred day, and I want to do something that's worth doing. And let's see what happens. Let's just see what happens. Amen.